Hey, welcome back, class. I thought I'd try this again, this time with the analysis paragraphs that we're starting in class. Now, the reason we did all these surveys and all this research is so that we could take away parts of it, take that data, look at some of the reasons behind our media use so that we can identify the similarities and differences in the patterns, provide really good in-depth reasoning for why we do, and then what the significance of all of that is. So, in the previous video, we looked at taking that data, identifying similarities and differences, and then saying to ourselves, okay, now that we have that, what do we do with it? And so, on the top of page 19 in your workbook, you'll see that there's basically a little bit of a bullet point kind of idea of how to structure your paragraphs. Remembering that a paragraph itself is just one idea or one topic that you're discussing. So before we go ahead and write this analysis, let's look at the kind of structure we want to do. Our first paragraph is just going to look at the similarities between you and your subject based on that data. So what's the same about how you used different types of media, or where you used it, or even why? And then once you've identified what's the same, we then need to look at why it is we use these things similarly. And that's where you have to go back into that workbook and think about the information that's there on things like access and exposure, our uses and gratifications theory, demographics, or what generation we were born in. That becomes your second paragraph. Now your third one is all about what are the differences between you and your subject in terms of how much you may have used media, where you used it. And then finally, again, the fourth one explains why those differences exist. And again, this is where you have to go back and think to the earlier lessons on demographics, social generations, access and exposure, and the uses and gratification theory. So the first place to start, now that you've familiarized yourself with that pattern, is to essentially pick the three sections from your collated data to write about. Now in the last video, I picked media and duration, types of technology, and the purpose. So what I'll do right now is I'll just start by talking about media and duration. And I'll use that as a little subheading to organize my work. The very first thing I want to do is list the similarities between my subject and I. So I could say, my subject and I both used digital media the most throughout the survey. Now, at this point in time, I want to go back and actually find the data that shows that. So when I go back and I look up, I go, I used it 56 times, they used it 88. 52 hours, 65. I used digital media 56 times throughout the survey for a total of, I think, 52 hours. I might have transposed those. While my subject used it 88 times for a total of 65 hours. So what I've done here is that first bullet point there. I've gone ahead and listed the similarities between the subject and I. Once I've done that, now I need to go ahead and explain why these similarities exist. So I have to go back and think a little bit about why it is we use digital media. And part of that has to do with our access and exposure, and the uses and gratification theory. So I could say, both of us use digital media a lot in our workplace. As a result, we are issued laptops by our employers to access and contribute our jobs. Therefore, because all our work information is presented in a digital format, we have both access and exposure to digital media. In addition to access and exposure, we both use digital media to complete or to gather information and teach our lessons. Therefore, it fulfills our need to be informed and educated. So I've touched on two things there, and that provides the basic explanation for why those similarities exist. Now moving on, it's kind of gone a little bit off screen now, is I need to explain the differences between my subject and I. So the differences between our use, the difference between the type of media we use is obvious when looking at the data in the survey. Although we both use broadcast and print media, my subject uses print media for a longer period of time than I do. I use print media, and this is where I might go back again to my survey and just make sure I've got all the dish. So I use it 12 times for 6 hours, but they use it 8 times for 16. Let's go back. I use print media 12 times for a total of 6 hours, whereas they only used it 8 times, but for a total of 16 hours. Now obviously I have to explain this, so I would say I use the print media for work to quickly access information on the job, whereas they used it so that should be a new paragraph. So here again I've identified the differences. So we go back up. I've identified the differences between me and my subject. I'll list that in pink. And now I've done that right here. So now I have to make that explanation. So I started by saying I use the print media for work to quickly access information on the job, whereas they used print media in the evenings to relax and unwind after work. Now, according to the uses and gratification theory, people use media to satisfy their needs. I use print to gain information, and they used it for escape and entertainment. So I've gone ahead and explained the differences. And by keeping those 4 paragraphs separated, what I've done is I've made sure the similarities and differences are clearly identified. I've gone ahead and I've made sure to use specific data that came from my survey. I have listed the reasons, going back to the previous information in our booklets about access and exposure. And I've also talked about our media needs. Now, by doing this, I've covered all the information necessary to meet the criteria. In the next video, we'll take this example, and what we'll do is we'll add in the research and the significance to take this initial answer and add more to make it worth a merit and an excellence. I hope this helps as a starting point. We'll see you back in class.